In this lecture, we're going to talk about how we ensure and monitor adherence to our pay policies, or at least our espoused pay policies within our organization. So when it comes to pay policies in our organization, our goal should be to enact pay practices and adhere to those pay policies in order to ensure internal equity, which is sometimes called internal alignment, and to ensure external equity, which is sometimes referred to as external competitiveness. So when it comes to evaluating our adherence to our pay policies, we can use regression-based approaches to identify what are the actual determinants of pay, such as percentage increase in pay raise and so forth, as well as how we're paying some people in a job, with, let's say, with respect to variable pay, such as spot awards or bonuses that they might be receiving, as well as piecework plans and incentive-based plans as well. Now, when it comes to evaluating adherence to pay policies, we can also do things like estimate compa-ratios to monitor adherence to pay policies, something we'll talk about in more detail in just a moment. And we can also visualize the association between variables like tenure and compa-ratios using scatter plots to identify the evidence of potentially pay compression or even pay inversion. So let's take a deeper dive into compa-ratios. So what is a compa-ratio? Well, a compa-ratio is a ratio that reflects how much employees are actually paid for a given job or pay grade as compared to the espoused pay structure and or policies. So how do we calculate a compa-ratio? Well, it just requires simple arithmetic, and in this case, simple division. So we can calculate a compa-ratio for a single employee, and that would just be taking the employee's actual pay and dividing it by the midpoint of their pay grade or pay range. Now, if we have a group of employees, let's say employees from a single job or employees from a single pay grade or a pay range, we can also calculate a compa-ratio for that group. And the way that we do it is, again, just using simple division here, and we would take the average actual pay of that group of employees divided by the midpoint of the pay grade or range that they reside within. Now, how do we interpret a compa-ratio? Well, if you multiply this ratio by 100, you get a percentage, or you can leave it as a proportion. It's really up to you. So if we're thinking about it from a proportion standpoint, so a compa-ratio in its raw form here, meaning it hasn't been converted to a percentage, for a group of employees, a compa-ratio of 1 would indicate adherence to a pay policy, presumably, because that would mean that on average, we're paying at the midpoint of that pay grade or range. We're not seeing drift there. Now, if we were to see a compa-ratio greater than 1 for a group of employees, this would mean that we are actually paying on average more than that midpoint of that pay grade or pay range in which those employees actually work. Now, if our compa-ratio is less than 1, that means that we're paying on average less than that midpoint. So what is a high or a low compa-ratio? Well, that really depends on context. It depends on your organization, what your pay philosophy is, your pay policy, and so forth. In some organizations, it might be permissible to have compa-ratios that range between, let's say, 0.8 to 1.2. But in other organizations, that might be deemed too extreme and unacceptable and too much variation there, too much range. So again, it really depends on your organization's pay philosophy, your policies, and so forth. So how do we determine if there's evidence of drift from our espoused pay policies? Well, one thing we should be concerned about is what's called pay compression, which is sometimes called salary or wage compression as well. So what is pay compression? Well, this occurs when more recently hired employees with less experience earn nearly as much or the same as more experienced, longer tenured employees in the same job, or B, when employees in a lower level job earn nearly as much or the same as employees in a higher level job. Now, pay inversion, which is sometimes called salary or wage inversion, is a more extreme case of pay compression. And so what is pay inversion? Well, again, it's more severe form of pay compression, and it occurs when a newer, less experienced employee in a given job earns more than another more experienced employee in the same job, or B, that person earns more than another employee in a higher level job. So this is where you get that inversion. And so sometimes this happens in situations where someone comes in, they're hired in, and they actually make more than their supervisor does, would be an example of pay inversion potentially. So Data visualization can be a great way to understand and try to identify and diagnose whether pay compression or even pay inversion might be at play. And so here's an example of using a data visualization called a scatter plot, in which we have on our x-axis here the compa-ratio values for individual employees here, where each one of these green dots represents an individual employee. So it represents their compa-ratio in relation to their tenure or length of service in years in this organization here. And so what we see here is that as compa-ratios grow higher, we see this general inverse relationship with tenure in years, such that people who have worked in the organization longer tend to have lower compa-ratios as individuals than people who have worked in the organization for a shorter amount of time, or I should say worked in that particular job for a shorter amount of time. And so this dashed line here right at 1 represents the midpoint. This would be if we were perfectly adhering to our compa-ratio. This is where someone is being paid directly on that midpoint of whatever pay grade or range they're in. And so here we expect there to be distribution or variation around this midpoint line here, this compa-ratio of 1, but here we actually see this inverse association. So this would likely be evidence of definitely pay compression and perhaps even pay inversion here, where you have people who have worked there for a shorter amount of time potentially making more on average than those people working there for a less amount of time here, okay? Ideally, we would most likely to see the opposite. We'd like to see a positive association here. Now, you could also use, depending on your sample size, where it's appropriate, you could also use correlation or regression-based approaches too to look at the actual statistical association between compa-ratios and tenure in years. So again, this would be evidence probably of pay compression and more specifically pay inversion here. So how do we ensure adherence to pay policies? So what can we do to make sure that we're not going to find these drifts away from our espoused pay policies? Well, a big thing that we can do is train managers on the organization's pay philosophy, its pay policies, and its pay structures, so they know what they're operating within, especially when they're making decisions regarding offers in terms of how much to offer a new employee regarding their starting wage or salary, as well as how much to allocate or distribute based on different factors, pay determinants, in other words, for raises and things like that, and other forms of variable pay. Now, we can also train managers on how to actually make pay decisions. So train them on which factors and how should they weight things in determining how much to offer someone, as well as how much to offer, or how much of a pay increase to offer someone or to allocate or distribute to someone. Now, what else can we do? Well, we can explain to managers and everybody else in the organization, including the employees themselves, the strategic importance of pay policies and practices and the value of adhering to those pay policies and practices, and potentially what would be the consequences if we did not. Now, we can also ensure adherence to pay policies by regularly evaluating the adherence to those policies on a regular basis using available data to avoid any kind of drift in terms of our practices relative to our actual policies. So this wraps up the lecture on adherence to pay policies.